Hi, everyone. Welcome to the August 6th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona. I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This is the podcast, a lot of races to discuss. We'll begin with Whitney Day at Saratoga, where McKinsey took down the Whitney over a very good field, but there were a ton of stakes races on that car. Really notable performances to go over. We'll wrap up the entire week at Saratoga, which included the Saratoga Derby and Saratoga Oaks, as well as a host of other stakes races. We'll talk about the West Virginia Derby at Mountaineer, some other performances from Del Mar last week, and we'll wrap up the show with some two-year-old races from across the country. Some really nice two-year-olds ran last week, and we'll talk about all of those promising runners. So I'll go ahead and welcome in Craig. Craig, it was good to see you in Saratoga this past week. I hope you had a good trip.
I did. I had a blast. It was good to spend some time with you. I am looking forward to a vacation where I actually get some rest, because you sure as heck don't get any at Saratoga. Constantly on the go and love every minute of it. But I got to tell you, I was pretty exhausted yesterday and very happy.
It's always a ton to do, a ton to see, and I wish I could have spent more time with you, but the schedule just never really stops, does it?
No.
We'll just dive right in because there's a lot to talk about this week. And we'll begin with Whitney Day because that was really the main event this past weekend. Some of the best horses in the country in action in the Whitney Stakes. And no real surprise that McKinsey was able to win. Maybe the dominant fashion of his victory was a little surprising to some because he really hadn't won that prestigious Grade 1 race yet in 2019, even though a lot of people do consider him to be the top handicap horse. And I think he really put to rest any concerns about whether he was the best horse coming in or whether the 9 furlongs would have been a hurdle for him. Really, none of those questions should have been asked because he could just do a whole host of things, and he was better than these horses on Saturday.
He was. It's kind of interesting. He actually got a 129 TimeformUS speed figure from us, and Yoshida actually got 1 point higher at a 130. But even as the guy that created these figures, I'm not sure I would agree that Yoshida was a better horse. Now, I'm not saying if they were to face off at 1.25 miles next time, I may not take a shot at Yoshida. But it just had to do with the pace. McKinsey was able to rate off a moderate pace that we have some of the fractions coded in blue. He took over. He won fairly easily, but I was impressed with both of the top two. They were clearly better than Vino Rosso and Preservationist, who ran basically okay, just kind of how they've been running all along. They proved they're probably a cut below real Grade 1 horses, as I think we probably suspected going in. But just really good effort from both of the top two, particularly McKinsey.
Yeah, he got a 132 final time figure for the race, which obviously was adjusted down a little bit because of the slow pace. But anything above a 130 is really Grade 1 territory solidly. And off performance like this, combined with his performance in the Met Mile, where he arguably should have won, maybe not arguably, he obviously should have won that race. He's got to be the leading contender for Horse of the Year at this point. He just basically has to hold his form through the fall. I know there's a question about him going the 1.25 miles, as you mentioned, and he really does have to prove it. I will say, as this horse has gotten older, he seems to have developed maybe not more stamina, but a better ability to rate early and finish off his races. Mike Smith has developed a really good rapport with him where he's just able to get him to shut down in the middle of these races. And coming to the top of the stretch, I was a little concerned that the entire field was ranging up and he might not be able to kick away from them again, because kind of like how he did in the Ali Sheba, Mike Smith let out the whole field come to him. And this horse just had such a finishing kick at the end of the race. If he can ride him that way in a 1.25 mile race, maybe he'd have a better chance of getting the distance than he did last year, just as a more mature racehorse. But I can't fault him going 1.1 miles. He's just the best horse in the country up those middle distances.
He is, and you wouldn't know it from the running line because it just shows seconds early, but he actually kind of conceded the lead just like he did in his previous race, the Tom's d'Etat, who we're going to talk about a little later. But yeah, I like how he did it. Mike Smith really seems to have the touch with him. I saw some people knocking the ride on Preservationist, and I really don't get it. I mean, he had a clear, easy lead. They weren't going particularly fast, so I just think he wasn't a horse that was good enough on this day.
Yeah, it was a little weird heading into the first turn because it originally seemed like Monongahela was being sent to the front. Then Jose Lezcano wrapped him up. Then it seemed like McKinsey was going to the front. Then Mike Smith backed off. And it was sort of like Junior Alvarado was going to stay with those horses. Then he was just sort of left on the front by himself. It's not like they were going that fast, so I don't think it was a bad place to be. Yoshida did come from way back, but I think that's because he ran an exceptional race. So I thought Preservationist and Vino Rosso, they both ran fine. They were just a little bit exposed as not quite at that grade 1 level against the best horses in the country, and the best horse in the country being McKenzie. So a really fun race, and interested to see where these horses go from here, but just great to see all of these top horses match up against each other in a great race like the Whitney. The most exciting race on Saturday, I don't think anybody would dispute, was the Test, which was run one race before the Whitney, as some of the fastest 3-year-old fillies in the country squared off. And it really lived up to the billing, as it figured that Serengeti Empress from her rail draw and Kofefi would hook up at some point in the race. Kofefi sort of let Serengeti Empress get the lead. They were going a pretty solid early clip, but she came to her at the quarter pole, and they just battled all the way down to the wire. Just a really thrilling race to watch.
Yeah, this was probably the highlight of my week watching this race. I mean, these were just two outstanding athletes that just laid it on the line the whole 7 furlongs. I mean, there was nothing slow about the pace. Originally, I was trying to talk myself into betting Royal Charlotte, but she just got bet off the board, and I didn't want any parts of that at those odds. As these horses looked the best, you just wondered if they might hurt each other. And as it turns out, I mean, they just blew the field away. I actually thought Serengeti Empress was going to come back right at the end, but she didn't quite do it. She actually got a little bit higher figure, a 127, than Kofefi, a 125. I'd say these two are very evenly matched, and probably the difference in the race was the post position draw.
Yeah, because it really did force Serengeti Empress's and Jose Ortiz's hand to go to the front. And Joe Rosario, who rode Kofefi, he's just so good at saving a little bit extra for the final 16th of a mile. He's got that strong hand ride that he utilizes for almost all of the stretch drive until the very end. And I think Serengeti Empress really was coming back at the end, but the winner just had a little bit left to hold her off. I mean, the fact that these 3-year-old fillies are running TimeformUS speed figures in the mid to high 120s, it's pretty amazing. You don't see that too often. And going back to early in the year, I mean, the fillies just looked so inferior to the colts. I mean, they were running speed figures that were barely above 110, most of them, even in the top races. And it's just kind of funny to see it reverse a little bit, or the fillies really catch up. We've seen a number of races now, the Acorn, this one, where horse and Kofefi's breakout performance at Pimlico, where these horses are just running exceptional speed figures. And it's great to see. I hope these two can stay sound and continue in these types of races towards the end of the year. Obviously, I think Serengeti Empress has a few more options because she can go the 2 turns as well. But just really awesome to see 3-year-old fillies running this fast.
Yeah, I think the one disappointment had to be Bellafina. I think she wound up going off the favorite or close to it, and she just had nothing in here. I think she's just a horse who hasn't really matured. I assume she was ready to go, about as ready as she was going to get. She was just overmatched in here.
Yeah, it was a little weird. It was as if she wasn't ready to race in a sprint, because they came out of the gate and she was just immediately like 5 lengths behind the field. As a younger horse, she could have easily gone a pace like this. So I don't know what that was about. She's just lost her edge or her sharpness, I guess, because she just wasn't ready to compete in this kind of race off the layoff, it would appear. She ran on okay to be third, but she was well behind the top 2 and did not earn the kind of speed figure that we know she's capable of getting when she's on her game. So a little unfortunate, but can't take anything away from the top 2 finishers. They just both put in exceptional efforts. Not quite as impressive, because we were missing the star attraction World of Trouble in the Troy Stakes earlier in the day. But I will say, even though World of Trouble didn't play, the 3 horses that finished first, second, and third, they all put on quite a show in this race, and they really got back to some of their best efforts, including the 2 gray horses trained by Christophe Clement. But they didn't win. The winner was Leinster, who I think was making his stakes debut on the turf. And this horse had always been bred for the turf. It took them a long time to get him over to the grass. And ever since Rusty Arnold did, he's just been unstoppable. This horse stalked outside a wide trip, ran down those 2 grays, and earned a track record. We saw many track records fall at Saratoga this past week, and this was one of them.
Yeah, it seemed like we had a track record a day, and another one almost just missed being broke. The one McKagan, who I don't think we're going to get to talk about today, had set earlier in the week, was almost broken a few days later. So clearly, with the turf was really fast. I got a lot of questions when the opening quarter popped up a sub 21, but I don't think there was any problem with the timing. It was just fast horses and a fast course. And like you said, these three really laid it down. A Disco Partner kind of maybe reverted back to his best form. Leinster, I didn't hear how you said it. Got a 121 for the win, which is his best. And he's just been a win machine since getting switched to turf. And it was just a really good effort. Pure Sensation even ran well to be third. I think we talked about him before. He's not quite the same horse outside of Parks as he is when he's there, but he's still no slouch. I mean, he got a 119 back in third place. So just a really solid sprint for older males. And I'm sure we'll see at least a couple of these show up in the Breeders' Cup if things stay healthy.
Yeah, it's great to see Disco Partner slowly but surely getting back to his better efforts. I will say I feel like the good Disco Partner, or the best version of Disco Partner that we saw maybe 2 or 3 seasons ago, he would have won a race like this with the kind of trip that he got, because Irad Ortiz really worked out just a perfect journey for him, saving ground on the rail. He got him one path off the inside around Rocket Heat at the top of the stretch, and he really had no excuse to lose from there. Leinster was just a better horse in this race, but it's good to see Disco Partner getting back some of those best efforts. And Pure Sensation, I think he's even 1 year older than Disco Partner, just continuing to fire top shots even as an 8-year-old. So nice to see these horses, but seems like there is a little bit of a changing of the guard going on in these turf sprint races as Leinster just is on the rise, and interesting to see where he can go from here, because he is one of the younger members of this division.
Yeah, the old Disco Partner would have never been run down once he made the lead, which happened here. So I agree with you. Good effort, but he's definitely, not quite the same as he was, but still a neat horse, gorgeous horse to look at. So I like having a horse like that around.
Yeah, I agree with that. I actually think Disco Partner, not Pure Sensation, I think Disco Partner is actually a full horse. So I wonder if he'd actually be a stallion one day. He doesn't have much pedigree, but boy, does he have a set of accomplishments as a New York bred. We'll stick with turf stakes races for the rest of the Whitney card. The Lure was run a little earlier in the day, going 1 mile and a 16th on the turf. Not the best turf horses in the country, but I think there are a few that could be on their way to better things, namely the top 2 finishers, Luke Cullen and Sacred Life. Luke Cullen only won this race by a nose, but I would say that he was pretty clearly the best horse in this race, because they were going a solid clip early. I don't know none of the pace figures are color-coded red, but Voodoo Song and Noble Indy really did open up on this field in the early going. And Luke Cullen was sort of caught in that weird spot between the first 2 runners and the rest of the pack, sort of racing on his own. And that's always a difficult place to be. And he made that early move to the lead. I think Louis Saez probably hit the lead earlier than he really wanted to. But he felt Sacred Life coming to him late, and he held that horse off. Luke Cullen just seems like the kind of horse now as a 5-year-old, after a very long layoff. He's just getting fit, getting back to his best races, and I would imagine it's going to be on to graded stakes company now.
Yeah, I would think so. He got a 119 for this race, which is borderline graded stakes company, maybe a little below. But as you mentioned, it wasn't a great trip. He was kind of in that chase position that we've talked about before. It's certainly not a favorite of mine. You don't really get any cover, and you're not really relaxed. But when Sacred Life came up to him, it actually looked like, with a furlong to go, he might go right on by. But it wasn't a case of not getting there. I think it was a case of Luke Cullen really digging in and holding them off and finding the wire. So I'm with you. I don't think there's any doubt he was the best horse in here.
Yeah, Sacred Life ran well to be second. I know he's a horse that was training well for Chad Brown and was making his first start for the barn after having a bit of a career in France. So he could possibly do well in the future. I think getting on the firm turf really did agree with him. But I know it wasn't the fastest race. I just feel like both of these horses have upside coming out of this, whereas some of those that finished behind them, we've seen a lot of them. I'm not sure horses like Ticonderoga are projected or really going anywhere at this point. I think they might be wrapping up their careers. And the shame of the race was probably Voodoo Song, because I guess he did go a little bit too fast on the front end. He can be a runoff sometimes when they get aggressive with him, but he just doesn't seem to be the same horse that he once was.
No, it'd be interesting to see if he can get in a race without Guido in there and see how he could do. But I agree. He's not the horse that won 4 races at a single meet. He definitely looks to have lost a step, but I'm not going to give up on him just yet. Speed can always be dangerous, particularly if he finds a paceless field.
Final stakes on the Whitney card was the De La Rose, which went as race 10, I believe one race after the Whitney, and looked like a pretty competitive race on paper, but not so much on the racetrack. As got stormy. She had hinted earlier in the year that she had taken a step forward for Mark Casse. She had competed well against some of the top fillies in the country in races like the Jenny Wiley and the Distaff Turf Mile on Derby weekend. And she had been off for a little bit coming into this race, but the class relief really did the trick for her. She just got back to those efforts, and really, the win never looked like it was in doubt. Tyler Gaffalione had a ton of horse underneath him, and she just widened at will at the end.
She did. This was the race I was talking about. I think it missed McKagan's track record by 0.02 of a second. And she did it really easy. She only got a 118. I say only because she's run better in the past. But she did what she needed to do here. I have no doubt she could step back up and be competitive with graded stakes fillies. And, just a really solid effort. Not a whole lot to say about the others. They look like your typical listed stakes performances. I don't see any of those horses jumping up and making a splash, but good effort from Got Stormy.
And not to say too much about the track record and McKagan, because we're not going to talk about McKagan's race in depth, but I do just want to mention, I saw a lot of people sort of outraged that a horse like McKagan would set a track record in a claiming or an optional claiming race. But I think you have to realize that track records so often are products of the racing surface and not so much the horses or the types of races that they're in. And we saw, I believe, 4 1-mile races on the inner turf at Saratoga go in times between 133 flat and 133 and 3/5 seconds. That's pretty unusual when the old track record is 133 and 1. So obviously the turf course, the inner turf course in particular, really both turf courses were just rock hard this past weekend and very fast. And I don't even think that was the highest speed figure McKagan's ever earned in his life. So it's just a product of how the surface was playing that we saw so many track records falling.
Right. And McKagan's a horse who really likes a tighter course. He runs well at Aqueduct on I guess, what's the new inner or the now it's the inner turf course. I forget how to name him. But, yeah, he's a horse. He's a real athletic horse that just likes to go fast. He always sets a fast pace, which is going to help with the final time. And he just really handles those tight turns well. So while he may have been a claimer, he's far from your typical claiming horse. I mean, he's a horse with a lot of ability.
Yeah, he earned almost $600,000 in his career, and he's a prior stakes winner. So I wouldn't get too down on McKagan, even though he did improve in this particular race. Moving on to the other stakes races from other days of the week at Saratoga, we'll talk about the 2 turf races for the 3-year-olds, beginning with the Saratoga Derby. This is the second leg of the Turf Trinity, part of the Turf Triple. I think the Turf Tiara is what they call it for the fillies. We had said exiting the Belmont Derby that this felt like a division where you could see a completely different result with a different set of trips next time. And that's exactly what happened in the Saratoga Derby. Actually, a horse coming out of the Belmont Derby was, or one of the horses not coming out of the Belmont Derby was the horse that won this race, A Thread of Blue. I know we had talked about him going back to the winter in one of our first podcast episodes about him being a horse for Kieran McLaughlin that seemed like he was really stepping forward on the turf. Things went awry for him a little bit in the springtime, and he had some time off. There were some questions about him getting the distance of this race, but Luis Saez did a great job rationing out his speed on the front end, and he was just able to hold them all off in the lane.
He was. This was a horse on the pace projector we showed as having a clear early lead, and sure enough, that's what he got. And if you get a quality horse on a clear lead, they're always going to be dangerous. And in this case, he never really got challenged. He didn't go particularly fast. None of the pace figures even hit the 120 mark. I mean, they're certainly not slow. It isn't like he was gifted like the Oaks, which we'll talk about later, where it was basically a joke as far as the pace goes. But in this case, I mean, he was just the best horse. He had plenty left. They left him alone up front. And, and it's kind of an interesting chart when you look at it because the horses behind him were nowhere near the lead. So you can't say it was a merry-go-round or anything like that. He earned the win. But the 2-3 finishers came from far back and made a nice effort. So decent effort, a 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure for A Thread of Blue. I think it's his best by a little bit so far, and probably puts him right up there with the top of the division along with any of the others we've seen. It's definitely muddled at this point.
Yeah, I saw some people saying that A Thread of Blue kind of stole the race on the front end. I wouldn't say that. He might have been the best horse actually as the winner because as you were saying, horses did close behind him. I will say that with the rails coming down and being set at 0 feet for this race, whereas we haven't seen that too much throughout the meet so far at Saratoga. Horses racing down on the hedge really did seem to have a bit of an advantage. We saw Cape of Good Hope get that kind of trip to be third. He was a long shot in this race, and he just rode the rail the entire way under a great ride from Julien Leparoux to be third in this spot. But I wouldn't say A Thread of Blue wasn't the best horse. He just ran really well to win. And unsurprisingly, the horses coming out of the Belmont Derby, we just saw them sort of flip-flop. The horses that were 1, 2, 3 in the Belmont Derby were actually all off the board here. The fourth place finisher in the Belmont Derby Digital Age was the second place finisher here. And I mentioned Cape of Good Hope, who really didn't run well in the Belmont Derby at all. He was the third place finisher in this race. So I'm not going to be shocked when we see a totally different result next time. I think the final leg of this triple series is the Jockey Club Stakes or some Jockey Club Derby, maybe, Belmont Park. And I think they're stretching out to 1.5 miles, I believe. So we'll see how these 3-year-olds handle that challenge. But I'm not going to be surprised when we see a totally different result in that race.
Yeah, I agree. You're right. They are stretching out to 1.5 miles. I know the one's called the Jockey Club Oaks. I can't remember what the one is called for the guys. Maybe it is Jockey Club Derby, but yeah, definitely. These turf races, a lot of times they do come down the trips. I didn't see a whole lot of bad trips in this one. That's why I'm willing to say Thread of Blue may have just been better than these. Sometimes people don't like saying that on turf. The rail is a factor, as you say. It hadn't been at zero very much, so it probably did help a bit. But, as we say, these are fun betting races because these horses, as long as they keep racing each other, are probably just going to take turns beating each other. Eventually, they're going to have to step up and face older horses, and I'm not sure I've seen anyone in this group with a not super strong outside of the top couple older male division, but I don't see anybody here that jumps out at me as wanting to tackle elders.
No, they really do seem evenly matched against their own age group right now, and none of them are really standing out at this point. I will say the one horse that might have had the toughest trip of those of the main contenders was actually Henley's Joy, who probably had it coming to him after that perfect trip in the Belmont Derby. He had to swing widest off the far turn and was really making a good run at the end, but I think the ground loss really got to him in this race.
Yeah, he's one of those horses. I don't remember. I've heard it around the racetracks for years. I just couldn't get behind him just because he's one of those, if you miss the wedding, don't go to the funeral types. Exactly. You got to pay off on him if you were a fan last time. So it was time to jump off ship this time.
Yes, that's often the case with those kinds of horses. We'll move on to the filly version of the race, the Saratoga Oaks, which is run on Friday. This one, not nearly as thrilling as it was just about as eventful as it looked to be on paper. Concrete Rose got out to the front end, slowed the pace down to a crawl under Julien Leparoux, and just kicked away pretty easily in the stretch. She was really flying through the lane. I think I looked at Trackus. She ran her final quarter mile in 21.7 seconds. So she was sprinting through the lane, and there was no way anybody else was getting anywhere near her with that kind of closing split.
No, and obviously in a race like this, we have all the fractions coded in blue. I think we had a 26 or something and a 51. I don't remember what exactly they were, but they were, harness times basically. And the 1-5 favorite is loping along. She's a horse that doesn't even really want the lead and was up on the lead. So I'm not sure what was going on in this race. They gave away a lot of money, but it didn't seem like anybody was too interested. Usually I'm a little surprised. I'm not all that surprised in these because a lot of times in graded stakes, fillies and mares, a placing is very important to them, probably even more than the purse money. But at this point, it isn't even a graded race. So I can't explain what happened out there other than it was a paid workout for Concrete Rose.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. It seemed as if everyone else was just riding to get some black type, even though I don't think black type is worth that much in this race. So I don't know. It was pretty puzzling. I really don't think any of the horses that ran behind her ran particularly well. I wouldn't pay too much attention to the fact that the horses behind her got a bigger speed figure boost for the pace than she did. Horses like Happen and Kelsey's Cross got higher TimeformUS speed figures. I know that's just a function of the algorithm with horses being compromised by the pace, but there's no doubt that Concrete Rose was by far the best horse in this race.
No, and for sure, I wish I could find a way to tweak the algorithm because I don't think it reflects reality in this particular race. But it's just such an anomaly with the pace being so slow. I had the pace figures at 75, and that's what breaking the race out. In reality, it's probably even slower than that. If I use the same variant for the other races, it might not hit 50. So just, really other than the winner, it was just kind of an ugly race. And I imagine she'll try the next leg at Belmont, and she'll probably be very tough to beat in there.
Yeah, I believe the fillies go 1.375 miles in the final leg, and that would be a challenge for her because, after all, she is a horse that won her debut going 5.5 furlongs on the turf at Saratoga. And I think all along people have had some distance questions about her, but she's had no trouble doing it so far. And we'll see if anybody actually shows up to face her, because nobody did this time. And next time she might just have it served up on a silver platter. We'll see, though. I hope some horses actually do challenge her, because there's a lot of money on the line for these races. The other stakes race on the turf on Friday was the Hall of Fame, sort of the version of the Belmont Derby for the milers, the horses that don't really want to go 1.25 miles. And Casa Creed, who has been a good horse all along, was really the class of this race and a deserving favorite coming in. Seemed like a competitive race on paper, but he just proved a little bit superior to this group. I know he only won by a nose, but he sort of had a wide trip throughout, and Junior Alvarado rode him like he was the best horse, and he was.
He was. He got a 114 for his win. So, only a point below the Saratoga Derby, obviously at a different distance. But I thought both the top two ran well, but he was clearly better. Sambaye was right there up on a moderate pace. I think we had the 6 furlongs coated in blue. But the rest of it was nothing special. And Casa Creed was able to just wear him down while wide. I'm curious what happened to, what's his name? Win. Who beat him? Is that the one that beat him last time?
Yes, I believe he read that he had a minor problem and they're giving him the rest of the year off, and we'll see him as a 4-year-old. Nothing serious, but they're just going to bring him back as a 4-year-old.
Okay, it makes you wonder when you see an allowance race and the third place finisher comes up and wins a graded stake. I was wondering why he wasn't in here, but nothing against Casa Creed. It was a very good effort. I thought he was better than you said as the margin, that head margin. I think he was definitely better than that would indicate. So I'm not sure what they're going to do with him. I imagine they'll keep him at the shorter distances. It looks like that's right in his wheelhouse, and I'll be looking to see where he shows up next time.
Yeah, Sambaye, who was second. I thought he got sort of a weird trip because going into the first turn, it seemed as if Jose Ortiz, on award winner, was going to cut over and set the pace. But it was almost as if Jose Ortiz never wanted to get to the rail, because he got about a 3/4 of a length lead on Sambaye, who was on the rail, and he just never cut over in front of that horse and tried to put him in the pocket. He just always left that rail path open for Louis Saez and Sambaye. And when they came to the top of the stretch, he just shot right through there. So it's almost as if I don't know what the story was, but it seemed as if they wanted to keep award winner off the inside, and it sort of left it open for Sambaye. He ran fine to be second. He didn't handle the turf in his turf debut, going 5.5 furlongs, but obviously the increase in distance really helped him in this spot. But I just thought he was second best in here, and Casa Creed was the better horse. I do think these horses are a slight cut below the horses we saw in the Saratoga Derby, even though it was a different distance. I think there was a little bit of a class disparity between these two races. But we'll see what they do moving forward. They're 3-year-olds, and they can always continue improving. The final stakes race on Friday at Saratoga was the Alydar, which was sandwiched between these two turf races. That was won by Toms d'Etat, who was getting some significant class relief in this race after he had run in races like the Pegasus World Cup and the Stephen Foster earlier in the year. He was also beaten by McKinsey in the Ali Sheba on Derby weekend. And just getting into this listed restricted stakes race really made the difference for him. He dealt with other speeds in here. They were going pretty fast up front, but he just sat off the pace and was superior to these in the lane.
He did. He got a 123 TimeformUS speed figure for the effort, which was actually a point or two below his last couple when in defeat he had run a 124 and a 125. But as you mentioned, he was dropping out a graded stakes company down into a listed stake. He caught a field he should be able to handle on his best, and he did. And as you say, I think it may even be a little bit better effort than it looks. It wasn't an easy trip. Like you say, he was up fairly close. The two that finished second and third came from much further back. Got decent figures. Wooderson got a 121 in second, which is as good as I can remember him running. So solid effort from those two, but Toms d'Etat was clearly the best horse, and I imagine he'll be trying graded stakes company again soon. I'm not saying he's a grade one type horse. He isn't, but he's definitely a cut above this group.
Yeah, I do want to give him credit because the pace really, even though it's not color coded red, it really did fall apart behind him in this race. So he made that early decisive move to the lead and he held sway at the end. So I think he deserves credit for that. Wooderson was the real surprise of this race because he had gotten his first major class test in his prior start in the Suburban and had failed miserably behind Preservationist. He was just never a factor in that race, finishing, I think, actually last in that spot. But he bounced back really well here, Rachel Alexander's little brother. And was closing at pretty well at the end to be second behind Tom Stata. I know Tom Stata was getting eased up a little bit at the end by Joel Rosario, so the margin of victory was a little bit less than it otherwise could have been. But nice to see Wooderson step forward. I think he's a 4-year-old now, so he still has some upside. And 121 is a solid number for a horse like that.
Yeah, and kind of interesting. He was back much further than he usually is in his races. So maybe they found something with him, and we'll see that running style out of him more going forward because he seemed to take right to it.
One of the coolest races from last week at Saratoga that probably doesn't get the accolades that it deserves was King Zachary winning the Birdstone on Thursday. I know it's probably hard to quantify a 1 3/4 performance that given that we just don't see that distance run well, basically ever, except for this particular race in the Breeder and the Marathon Stakes on Breeders' Cup weekend. But this was a pretty special performance by King Zachary because he's obviously a horse that really does want to go this far. And it seemed as if Marconi was carving out a pretty fast pace for the distance, all things considered early, because I think he went 24 and 49, opening up a little bit of daylight on the rest of the field. For a demanding distance like this, those are solid fractions. And yet King Zachary, who wasn't that far off that pace, came home really fast in this race. I was looking at Trackus. He ran his final quarter in 24 and 2 or something like that, and his final final half in I think 48 and change. I mean, this horse was just flying home at the end of a race, and most horses should be staggering.
He is, and I mean that's why he won by 8.5 lengths. I mean the rest just didn't have a whole lot left. He looked like he was in another league. And, normally these races are kind of tough to get a handle on, but I rated this one because it's, one of some note. I usually don't do races over 1.5 miles unless they're graded stakes, but I did this one anyway. And I had a pretty good foundation with Marconi and Rocketry running over and over again at longer distances. So I have no problem with that 124. I think it's a legit figure. I think it was very well earned, and it was another one of those track records we were talking about. I'm not sure how much weight to put onto that thing. If I'm not mistaken, is this the one I think Man O' War held maybe?
It's actually really fun to see what's going on in this division because it's cool what they're doing at NYRA. I know that these races don't get big fields and some people don't like seeing these very long dirt races. They don't get the point of them, but they keep scheduling them. It is kind of cool, though, that you're seeing certain horses really just find their niche in these longer races. Horses like Rocketry and Marconi and King Zachary. And we saw a few from years ago, even a horse like Campaign out in California. A race like the Brooklyn on Belmont Day is getting a really competitive, diverse field of runners. It's pretty awesome. And we're actually seeing them break some long-held track records. Going back to last fall, Rocketry broke Man O' War's track record for 1 5/8 miles at Belmont.
That's the one I was thinking of.
That had stood for almost 100 years. And in this race, King Zachary broke the track record by over 2 seconds, which in horse racing terms is just mind-boggling. You usually see track records broken by hundreds of seconds. I know it's a longer distance, but he broke Ray Count's track record that was set in, I believe, 1928. So this one is... what is that, 91 years old that he broke that track record. So it's just really cool. And you go back and look at the accomplishments of some of these horses that they're breaking the track records of. Ray Count, I was looking up his history. He actually won the Kentucky Derby. And as a 4-year-old, they shipped him over to England and he was second in the Ascot Gold Cup. Can you imagine that today? I mean, that's just unimaginable. But pretty cool to see King Zachary take down a track record held by a horse like that.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I want more of these races. I think they're great. And the more you run, I think you'll find more horses that find that's their thing. There's especially these older horses. When you watch these longer races overseas, you get a lot of horses that stick around that normally, would be retired or just wouldn't be as effective. So it gives them a place to run. We can use all the horses we can get running races, and I hope NYRA keeps writing these.
Before we get to the 2-year-old races, there's one more race I want to talk about from Saratoga on Sunday, the Way Up, where Fool's Gold won. I don't have a ton to say about this race. I think the big story of this race was the fact that Santa Monica just didn't really run her race in this spot. She was the heavy favorite coming in, and she was just kind of dull. She really had her shot at the top of the stretch and just couldn't produce that late kick. And it was actually the other Chad, her stablemate Fool's Gold, who has really improved since he stretched her out in distance. And she got the victory over some other rivals that probably just aren't quite at this graded stakes level.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The one thing I saw, Naira didn't offer show betting on this race, which was really perplexing to me, because when I looked at it, I said, Santa Monica's not that good. Why are they not having show betting on this? And, sure enough, she hit the board. So I guess maybe there is the possibility there could have been a negative show pull. But anyway, I mean, I don't care one way or the other if they offer show betting. I just found it odd in this case that she just didn't look all that good to me. She didn't look like a 6-5 favorite to me, and that's how she ran. She's, these are listed stakes fillies, really, maybe grade 3, and I think that's what we got.
Yeah, I was trying to take a shot against her in this race. I just did with the wrong horse, because I know Santa Monica had been winning some races earlier in the year, but she wasn't running the kind of speed figures that she had in the past, and she was just eking these decisions out or losing as the heavy favorite by a nose, and just not really running the same kinds of races. I think she's a 6-year-old now, so she's getting a little long in the tooth, and she's just probably not the same horse that she was last year. And her stablemate, who is, I think, only a 4-year-old, has just surpassed her at this point. But all of that said, these are not the top fillies out there. Chad Brown has probably 10 more that are better in his stable going this distance. So I don't think we'll be seeing them step up above grade 3 company anytime in the future. We'll head out to Del Mar to discuss some races there, including some 2-year-old races. We're going to save the 2-year-olds for the end of the podcast, though. We'll begin with the Yellow Ribbon, which was run on Saturday, and pretty salty field lined up for this race. The headline attraction was obviously Vasilika, who has been just a terror in California for the past couple of years for Jerry Hollendorfer, who was back as the listed trainer of her in this race. And she went down to defeat. I think she was the odds-on favorite in this spot. I know Santa Anita is really her home, but she's run well at Del Mar in the past, too. She just didn't quite have that same punch in the lane that she's had in prior starts. And Beau Recall, who had been, I think she started her career out in California, but Brad Cox brought her east, and she had success at the fairgrounds and, of course, on Derby Day and the Distaff Turf Mile, second in the Just a Game on Belmont Day, and she got another graded stakes here in the Yellow Ribbon. Pretty close finish, though. It didn't look like she was going to win when I first watched it.
No, yeah, she definitely started her career. She used to be trained by Simon Callahan. I'm not sure what happened that she switched to Brad Cox's barn, but she seems to have found a new lease on life. We've talked about her many times on here. She won a big race on Derby Day. She came back and ran very well on Belmont Day to run a good second, and then she shipped out to California to take the Yellow Ribbon, which this used to be one of the top races in the division. It's a little bit sad to see what it's now grade 2. It used to be just a huge race, run much later in the year. But, it was a good effort. It drew some shippers, as you say, not just Beau Recall, but Valedictorian? Yeah, Valedictorian, who we've talked about many times here, who's just as solid a filly as they come, basically always runs the same race. Ran a good 4th in here, so I had to watch this one a few times. I mean, it was really an exciting race. I missed it as I was at Saratoga that day, but good effort. Beau Recall got a 121, which is even a little bit better than she's been running in her last couple races. Storm the Hill was right there, and Vasilika just always runs about the same race. She just faced a little bit better horse this time.
Yeah, Beau Recall, it's funny to talk about her trip because a lot of things went right for her, but some things also did go wrong. Coming around the far turn, Drayden Van Dyke was trying to come through inside of a rival, and she had to steady a little bit, and basically she lost about a half length or a length of position at that point. And also just consider the fact that she's a horse that is one of these late runners, and she was much closer to the pace than usual in this spot. And she's a horse that when she's run her best, she's kind of gotten to the outside and she winds up and makes one big late rush. And she sort of had to stop and start a few times in this race and come through on the inside, which is not something she usually does. So she had things go right, but she also had things go wrong. And I think she did well to get up in this race. I had to watch the finish a few times because she got quite a bob. It was almost impossible to see her nose get down on the wire first, because it really did on the first couple of viewings seem like Storm the Hill had stolen this on the front end, but she just got her nose down on the wire at just the right second.
Yeah, and Vasiliki, I'd like to see her again with Flavien Prat. I'm not saying Julien Leparoux did anything wrong here, but it seems like Flavien Prat really fits her, and maybe she just didn't take his ride like he did. She did her normal pilot, and I just think he fits her, and he would be she'd run a better race with him in the saddle.
Yeah, I don't dispute that. Those 3 wide without covered trips on the turf are never the ones you really want, and that's sort of what happened to her in this yellow ribbon. Another turf stakes that occurred last week at Del Mar was the La Jolla on Sunday, where Kingley, who was making his turf debut in this spot for Bob Baffert, looked like he was going to get swallowed up at one point after leading for much of the way, but he really found another gear in the stretch and just was able to gamely fend off all of these challenges and win his turf debut.
He did. He's a horse by Tapit, so he certainly has every right to be fine on the turf. He was coming out of Game Winners Losal Derby, where he set the pace before, being passed, which is, I guess, this flatters Game Winner a little. I'm not sure how much being on a different surface, but I thought it was a really good effort by Kingley. I know we talked about how much we like these horses on the turf that just go, and he actually opened up a big lead. But I think the rider, I think it was Mario Gutierrez, kind of let the field come back to him. It isn't like he was getting tired. He just saved the little horse for the stretch, and when they hit it, he had just enough left to hold off Neptune Storm, who I believe was the favorite in the race. I think he was like 9-5 or something like that. But it was just a game effort by the winner, and I think there's no doubting he was best here.
Yeah, I mean, he couldn't have kept up the pace that he was going at, because I think he went 22 flat for the opening quarter. He really just ran off at the start of this race. And I thought Mario Gutierrez did what you want to do. You want to give these horses a breather at some point, even if you are giving away your advantage on the backstretch. And that's what he's able to do. And he saved enough for the end. It's a little rare to see Bob Baffert winning graded stakes races on the turf, but he's got one that can run on both surfaces now and is probably a little better on the turf. So it'll be interesting to see where he goes from here. On Sunday, one race before the La Jolla, actually, in an allowance race, we saw Landeskog get a little class relief going the 6.5. I believe it was 6.5 furlongs. I'll double check that. 5.5 furlongs. Yep. It was one of those between distances. Cutting back in distance after just getting cooked in the pace in the Woody Stevens. Really, that race was a tough one for any horse that wanted to be up near the front end, which is what Landeskog wants to do. And he was just able to flaunt his speed in this spot and show what kind of talent he really has.
Yeah, he's definitely a fast horse. He's I don't have the official figure. My assistant actually does Santa Anita, or Del Mar and Santa Anita. But looking over the worksheet, I'm pretty sure he's going to get a high teens, maybe a 117, a 118, something like that. And he's just a fast horse. Like you said, he got cooked into Woody Stevens like basically every other horse in that field did. But he's been fast. We talked about him after his debut at Oaklawn Park when he debuted with a 114. He lost the stakes at Oaklawn, where he was just run down by Nitrous, who's going on to run second in a couple of very nice races in New York. So he's a quality horse. He's a really good 3-year-old sprinter, and I assume he's going to be moving back into stakes company rather.
Yeah, totally, as he should, because he's running the kind of speed figures that suggest that's where he belongs in graded stakes company, and I think he showed that here. We'll stick with the 3-year-olds, and before we talk about some of the juvenile runners, just 2 more out-of-town races to discuss. The West Virginia Derby was run on Saturday at Mountaineer Park, the feature race there, and Mr. Money continued his tour de force across the middle of the country before he goes on to, I would assume, a more prestigious target here, and another pretty respectable TimeformUS speed figure in this race, and just was a dominant winner once again. All of these races that Mr. Money is running are like carbon copies of each other.
Yeah, he got yet another 121. The final time was 122. We knocked it down for a little bit because of the slowish pace. And even if you didn't use pace figures, you had to know the pace wasn't much when Plouquet Parfait was actually on the lead. I sort of watched this race. It was a little tough to do because, like seemingly happens every year, they ran right on top of the Whitney, which is just mind-boggling in its own right. But I had it on my my tablet, kind of eyeballing it while I was watching the Whitney, and just the same old strong, good effort from Mr. Money. He clearly outclassed these horses. I think next time, for now, they're pointing to the Pennsylvania Derby, so I think he's going to have to step it up. And we're no doubt he's a good horse, not knocking him a bit, but there are still some questions, and I think they'll get answered at Park.
Yeah, I respect the kind of horse that he's turned into because he's just reeling off these 120 plus speed figures like it's nothing. But he's not facing the top 3-year-olds out there. I mean, no disrespect to Plouquet Parfait. He's just not. It's not really a grade 1, grade 2 kind of horse. And that's really the best other horse that he was meeting in a race like the West Virginia Derby. And you could say a lot of the same things about the other races that he's coming out of. So it's about time for Mr. Money to meet a grade 1 quality field because he's running grade 1 quality numbers. He's just got to do it against the right horses. And I understand they don't want to run in the Travers because it's 1.25 miles and he'd be a little questionable going that distance, and probably turning back to the race like the Allen Jerkins is a little questionable, even though he has run very well around one turn in the past. But I think we could be heading into the end of the year really not knowing how good Mr. Money really is. So I just hope that he can step up and do it against the top horses because it's really an unknown until they actually face that top company.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, no knock on a horse like Chess Chief, who ran second. He's an improving 3-year-old. He's getting good at the right time, but he's still not the kind of horses we saw in races like obviously the Jim Dandy and the Haskell. I understand, like you said, who wants to go in the Jerkins and run in the Chance a lot, so you can kind of see him taking this spot here. But I imagine with the purse of the Pennsylvania Derby, he's definitely going to face some much tougher horses if that's indeed where he shows up. So far, his campaign kind of reminds me a little bit of Lost Code as a 3-year-old. That might be a little bit before your time, but he was a favorite horse of mine, and he kind of did this tour where he kind of beat up on all the mid-range track derbies and won a lot of money, and eventually proved that he could hang with the better older horses, winning some grade 1s, coming close in some others. He almost won the Haskell that year. So, you just never know till they show up. I'm not sure he's a horse I'd want to bet on. I imagine he'll probably get played more than I would like. These kind of horses, I'd prefer they were running better speed figures than the horses they'll be stepping up to face if I'm really going to back them, because it usually isn't the case where horses running in lower class races step up and run bigger figures when they're face tougher competition.
Yes, and I think the assumption often is that they can because they're winning in such visually impressive fashion, but in actuality, that's often not the case. So you do want to see them actually do it. So I'm a fan of Mr. Money, and that's the only reason that I'm saying that, because I do think he's a really cool horse. Before we move on to the juvenile races, one more race to talk about that you actually highlighted for me was the Shepperton Stakes at Woodbine on Sunday, where just a really cool old horse, Pink Lloyd, just won again. I think this was the 20th win of his career in 25 career starts. He's just is so dangerous in these sprint races between 6 and 7 furlongs on that synthetic track at Woodbine, which I believe all of his starts have come over. And I know some people find it hard to get excited by a horse that just keeps winning these lower level races, but he runs really respectable speed figures, and I think he deserves his due.
Yeah, that's all. I just wanted to mention any horse that's won as often as he has, including he's won quite a few graded stakes there at Woodbine. He's been around long enough to survive the switch from the old poly track to Tapeta, so it's not even been the same surface the whole time. He's just a really cool sprinter. He's only going to get, I think, about a 110 speed figure for this one, but really that's all he needed to run. He could have won by as much as a rider wanted to win by here. He's a horse capable of running in the 120s, and as a 7-year-old gelding, I assume he's not going anywhere anytime soon. We're going to get to keep seeing him run every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks, something like that. And I'm a guy who always tunes in to watch him.
Yeah, no, and watching this race in particular, you could just see he was going to win the race around the far turn. And he's not one of these speed crazy horses. I think he was more in the past, but it seems like as he's gotten older, he's been much more content to ride a few lengths off the pace and relax and finish off the races in the stretch. This was now his fourth win of 2019. He seems like he's gotten back on track, and he's in as good form as he ever was now as a 7-year-old. So I haven't heard the clamoring for him to run against tougher horses like you do here for some other ones that put together these win streaks. It seems like his fans just appreciate him for running in the races that he does and winning them. So just a neat older horse that's now won well over $1 million. We'll wrap up the podcast this week by quickly talking about some 2-year-old races from a few different venues across the country. We'll begin with a race from Saratoga, the Adirondack Stakes on Sunday. And the two major players in this race coming in were Frank's Rocket and Magic Dance, who was coming off a stakes win at Churchill Downs. Frank's Rocket was coming off a maiden win at Churchill Downs. Frank's Rocket took all the money in this race. Didn't work out the best trip, though, and I think that allowed Perfect Alibi to sort of come through and grind out the win and beat her.
Yeah, watching this race, I don't think there's much doubt that she was probably the best horse. This race, I actually watched this from up in the announcer's booth with my friend Larry Comas, and it was quite a mess. I know personally he wasn't thrilled with his call, but what could you do? I mean, there was a point there with about a furlong to go where I think every horse was within ahead of each other. And it was just a matter of who was going to get the cleanest trip. And Perfect Alibi was able to do that, unsurprisingly, under Irad Ortiz, who I think has just proven himself the best rider there is right now. He just always seems to do the right thing and be in the right spot. I do want to say from a speed figure perspective, I gave this race a 105, and it is a total breakout from all the other dirt races on the card. Had I used the same variant as the other races, this would have got a very slow rating. But I just don't think there was any point. There's no way they ran as slow as those races would have made you believe. There was quite a bit of work done on the track. There were 3 turf races run before this race. So I really don't have any problem breaking it out, or I did make that notation on our figures and our little question mark code. But it's not a race I really have any doubts about. I think the rating is solid, and I'm going to bet these horses off of it going forward.
Yeah, and it wouldn't really be surprising that Perfect Alibi could run a faster figure in this race because she was one of those horses that was compromised by the Gold Rail on Belmont Week. I know some people forget that the rail was still the place to be on June 6th, even though they didn't run that many dirt races that day. I think that was the Thursday of Belmont Week. But she was outside the entire way in that Astoria Stakes, and it shouldn't be a major shock that she improved out of that effort. And she's also a horse, Perfect Alibi, that's bred to run all day. I mean, her dam side especially. I think she's a half sibling to that turf router Noble Thought, who really can go as far as 1 1/8, 1 1/4. So it's no surprise that she wants to go longer, and she proved that here. Frank's Rocket, as you alluded to, just unfortunate. I wouldn't even say it was totally Julian Leparoux's fault because he had her in a good spot early. Just with these 2-year-olds that were drifting all across the track, he couldn't really find a seam at the top of the stretch, and she probably should have won, and it's a little unfortunate, but she can get them next time. I'm sure most of these horses will show up in the spin-away because the top 3 were very closely matched at the end. Magic Dance, she's the one that I thought didn't really have any excuse. She just seemed to be a really fully developed filly when she first debuted at Churchill back in June, and maybe the others have caught up a little bit by this point, but the top 3, they're all nice horses, and I hope to see them back in the spin-away. We'll move on to a race at Gulfstream Park, actually, the only race from Gulfstream we'll talk about this weekend. And Chance It, a horse that I believe we had discussed when he broke his maiden a few weeks ago, made his stakes debut in the Dr. Fager, one of those Florida-bred restricted races, and was just dominant once again. I think he actually repeated the number that he ran in his maiden victory last time, and just seems like a burgeoning, nice horse in Florida that we might see against Open Company at some point.
Yeah, I remember when you pointed this one out back in June. I kind of had to look like, why are we talking about a race from Gulfstream? And then I watched it and said, oh, yeah, he looks pretty good. And sure enough, he backed it up here. I mean, it was no real surprise. He was 1-5 in this race, but he basically ran the same race, going a little bit longer distance. He set a solid, but not crazy fast pace. So he doesn't look like a horse who's going to have trouble with a little more distance. And he got another 104. I imagine he'll stay in that Florida Stallion series. and those races gradually get longer. And we've seen horses come out of those before, and eventually move north to New York or show up in the Breeders' Cup. So he's definitely won the track. He showed some real ability and certainly some good speed.
Yeah, for sure. I think he's a horse that clearly has some real sprint ability. At Woodbine, we saw a 2-year-old, kind of like Chance It, that's just dominating the local competition. That's Keep On Truckin' for Catherine Day Phillips. Kind of an obscure pedigree on this horse. I don't really know his sire, Society's chairman. I don't really remember that horse. I have to look him up. But this horse has just been totally dominant in his 2 races. I believe he won his debut by almost a dozen lengths, and he came back and easily beat this field in the Clarendon Stakes, going the 5 furlongs, and just a really nice horse over the synthetic surface.
Yeah, and he got a 100 TimeformUS speed figure for the effort. And, even though he won by almost 8 lengths, there was another well-regarded horse trained by Mark Casson here named Meyer, who was 8-5 compared to Keep On Truckin's 3-5. And he just blew that horse's doors off. We do have the fractions coated in blue as he set a slow pace, but Keep On Truckin' really finished this race off strong. And he looks like a horse who's definitely going to be able to get some more distance. You never know about the surface with these types, if he's going to stay at Woodbine or venture away, but he certainly loved that synthetic track, and he looks like a real player there.
Yeah, he's one that might be a little better than the speed figures even rate him, because he's been very visually impressive in his races. And we'll wrap up the show by just mentioning 2 2-year-olds that ran at Del Mar last week. The one that was a little more high profile was the Sorrento winner, Amalfi Sunrise. We talked about her debut a few weeks ago when she won at Santa Anita in one of the fastest maiden races that I think we saw at Santa Anita from this past spring-summer meet. But she took another step forward to win this Sorrento. She defeated a good field. I know her main rival, Comical, didn't really show up in this race, but she just destroyed them. She went pretty fast early and just easily widened in the stretch with really big reaching strides coming down to the wire. A really impressive performance. I know it wasn't the fastest race against the clock, but just watching it, I just like the way she did it.
Yeah, I did as well. She got a 104 in her debut at only 4.5 furlongs. She got 100 here. I'm not going to split hairs here. I think this was the more impressive race, actually. She was facing a little more competition, going a little more distance. She set a solid pace, and she wasn't alone. She was challenged a little bit earlier and just shook that horse off and ran away from him. So really a promising filly. I imagine we'll see her in the Del Mar debutante for trainer Simon Callahan, and look forward to see her. There's been a lot of good 2-year-old fillies out west, as there always is, and look forward to that race to see who else shows up.
We began the show with Bob Baffert, and we're going to end it with Bob Baffert. He unveiled a 2-year-old first-time starter on Sunday at Del Mar, 8 Rings, who easily won his debut, opening up in the stretch, got a little competition on the turn, but just really widened away at will at the end. This is a horse that seems like he might go longer. He's by Empire Maker out of a multiple stakes winning dam who won at a variety of distances. No surprise that Bob Baffert is a top 2-year-old, but this one seems like he could be pretty special.
Yeah, this is probably the most exciting 2-year-old I've seen this year. I went back and watched this race. The figure's probably going to be about a 110. Like I said, I don't do Del Mar, but pretty simple. He ran the race right before Landeskog, who we talked about earlier, who got that, what I said is going to be about a 117. Sorry about the dog. Somebody decided to come to my door right now, so we'll ignore that. But, yeah, just a really impressive performance. And what makes it even more impressive is the breeding. As you said, this horse looks like he should be able to handle plenty more distance. And given the trainer, there's no doubt that if this horse is up for it, he can get him there.
I'm glad that I got the visual of your dogs this weekend via pictures, so I could sort of match the bark to the face, maybe. Yeah, no, I totally agree about 8 Rings for a 2-year-old first-time starter in the 5.5 furlongs. This was really impressive, and just to highlight again, he's by Empire Maker. Don't really think of Empire Makers as progeny of that are going to winning first time out as precocious 2-year-olds. So this is one that really could have a say in some races stretching out later in the year. We'll just see what happens and what other bullets that has to fire in his barn, because I'm sure there are many that we haven't seen yet. So Those were all the races from this week. Some really top performances. That's going to continue to be the case as we talk about more races throughout the summer. Craig, as always, it was good to talk about the races with you. Good to see you this weekend. And you can always listen to us on the Daily Racing Form podcast. Pacecast. Tune in on dref.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, SoundCloud, any of those places, or you can check us out. So thanks for listening this week, and we'll be back at you with more recaps next week.